kind of a magic thing, so this isn't something to know or find out, is das web client. So here we've created the payload that we need to give to the API in order for it to issue us authentication into the system. The next thing we need to do is define the URL, which, since we know what our site is, and since our documentation tells us what the URL is, should be relatively straightforward. We grab our URL, and we combine it with our site. Next, we need to fetch. So we say fetch URL. Going back to our documentation, you see that this needs to be posted. There are different ways to communicate with an API. Posting means that you give it data in order to either create something like a token, or really that's it. Get means you're just asking for it to give you something based on the question that you're providing. There are other verbs related to how you communicate with an API, but those go beyond the scope of what we're doing today. So you need to say that the method you're going to use is post, the body of your request, with your form data, and that should effectively be it. Now, fetching is what we call asynchronous. What that means is that there's an amount of time that this operation takes to go to the server to build a response, the server to bring that response back to you. In order to work with asynchronous code in JavaScript, there's a number of methods, but I like using just async syntax. And what that allows you to do is tell your code to wait for the execution of this to complete before proceeding. Now, the fetch response, this is getting a little in the weeds, is an object that you need to convert into something called JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. What we're doing right here, this object is effectively also JSON. You will see in programming, this is how pretty much all objects are defined. And so, response JSON. And then the last thing you need to do is return a value. And what that means is that when you call this function later, oh, it's just, oh yeah, thank you guys. God, whoever thought live coding in a demonstration was a good idea. And now we can log that out and put a debugger point on that to make sure that it's all as expected. Now, well, actually we don't need to do that here because this is not the entry point for our application. So what we can do, pull this out into our initialization code. Now, in JavaScript, in order to share functions between files using this pattern, you need to export the function. So you say export, fetch off, and then over in our initialization code, we're no longer interested in this stuff. All we need to do is import fetch off from our services auth file. Now, because we're returning our token from that function, we should receive it. So just review your code, creates a form, posts it to the token URL, gives it the data that it needs to do this successfully, should return the JSON response of it, and the fun part is always seeing what you broke without realizing it. Let's try that. Form data is not defined. That's because we are using the wrong node version. And that's on me. Perfect. So you can see right here, it says form data cannot be invoked without new. Because form data is a class, you have to instantiate it like that. Easy enough. All right, so we have successfully made it to our token. We've now retrieved it from EarthRanger. Here you can see a few things about no auth token. One is that it gives you a token that you use to access the system itself. It gives you a number of seconds until that token expires. And it gives you a new token to hand to the system that you can use to refresh yours. If you were writing a real integration, you would want to use something called a long-lived token, but that goes beyond the scope of this conversation today. Okay, so when you get this access token returned from logging in, that's what you then say, I am this user, EarthRanger, give me my data. You attach it to what's called a header, which is just an additional piece of functionality passed to your request. You say headers, header 1, whatever, etc., etc. This is just extra data to kind of give context to your request. In this case, it's called a bearer token, and you give it in an authorization header. And once you have that token, you want to store it somewhere, and just because I'm lazy and I have preferences, I like to use something called Redis. Okay, so our application works, it gets our token, all is good. We can end it for now, and we can move to the next step. Should be step 3. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I keep making changes. Silly me. Okay, so in order to install Redis, you need to use what was one of the prerequisites we discussed earlier, Homebrew. Using Homebrew, simple, you say brew install and then the package name. And then if your internet connection exists, it runs a few commands. And it comes through. While we're waiting on that, let's look at what we want to do next. We have our token, we're going to store it, and we're going to use it to fetch events. This is where you go back to the API documentation. Which again, please take note of this URL. As long as you're logged in as an administrator, this is your source for all information about how to interact with EarthRanger programmatically. So, we want events. Let's jump to events. You can expand the events section, and it tells you a few things. You'll see all of these different ways to interact with the events inside of EarthRanger. All of these are different ways to get pieces of your data out of the system or created and updated inside of the system. There's a lot of power here. Things that aren't necessarily exposed via the user interface, such as deleting events and event categories, and updating certain things individually. We know that we just want to get a list of events. That's easy, it's at the top. Here you have a description that's written directly into the source code of EarthRanger. It describes query parameters. This is something that you add to your request in order to get more, in this case, to filter your response. So bounding box, we're not going to deal with. There's a lot of different query parameters for the events API. All we're going to worry about right now is page size. It's pretty straightforward. It says, I will ask this API for information. You will give me a certain number of responses per request. That's what a page size is. In combination with page, that allows you to walk through your events without making a huge request that takes too long, times out, or takes forever to give you meaningful information. You can give this a page size of 5. Using the interactive API documentation, you can just execute that request directly, and then it'll give you your response. So here you can see the 5 most recent events added to EarthRanger for the playground. This makes it relatively, in my opinion, it's a relatively straightforward interface. You just make a request, you say how many you want, and it gives you a list. All right, let's see if Redis is, okay, great. So, make sure Redis is running. So Redis is a database. Sort of. It's more than that. It's an in-memory store mechanism that people use for all sorts of things, but man, that's annoying to have me say to you. So what we want to do for right now is hold the token in Redis, share it to other files. That way you request it once, and then your entire application has access to it. You can persist it, you can store it, you can get it later. So in order to do that, we need the JavaScript Redis client. It's software that talks with the database. So you say npm I install, like we did for other dependencies, Redis. Pulls that down, and you can see now in your package.json, it's been added to your dependencies. All right, next thing we want to do is check out some of this code. You see that in our initialization, we're creating a Redis client. We're importing our fetch auth service. We're creating the client, we're connecting to it, we're pulling our token, and then we are setting it in the database. And so, once again, we run our script and make sure that it does what we'd expect. When it says clean exit, that means the full thing has executed. And if you want to check on any point in your code, again, setting a debugger breakpoint. Here we see that we're saving a token based on your username, and we're just inserting the token that we received from the system. All right, we are in business. And now that we have done that, we can move on to what we just discussed in terms of fetching the events themselves. All right, so we are going to explore the event service. Again, you bring in your site name from the process. You pass it to the API with what you learned over here, which is that the URL is API v1.0 activity events. You know the method that you want is get. Get is default for fetch operations, so you don't need to tell it that. So here we go. We're saying we require an access token, and if you haven't given an access token, throw an error. An error object is simply a way to tell your application something went wrong. Here's details about what it is. You take this known string from your documentation and you combine it with your site, which we know to be playground.pamdas.org. We again fetch to that URL, giving it the information we discussed before, the access token. And we're asking for JSON. And then again, we return that response as JSON. So inside of here, you'll see that we store our token. We're not doing anything with it yet. We hand that token to fetching events, and then we make sure that it worked as expected. So you can again run your code, and we have hit this point in the process without any errors. So you can inspect your results to see. This view's a little funny, but when you hover over your results in most code editor debuggers, it will give you the value that you're inspecting. In this case, you can see there are 25 items in a list. If you open each of these, you can look at the full data. This is everything that describes an event in EarthRanger. When you look at any UI using EarthRanger data, this is what's being fed into it to make that. You can see that it's in the ecology category. It has a certain date it was created at. It's this event type. It's described as GeoJSON, so you can use this to, say, generate and export GeoJSON for your events if you need to load it into a different system, etc., etc. It has a unique identifier, a direct URL to the image. It describes the location, state, everything that you're familiar with in EarthRanger if you're a current EarthRanger user. Okay, so cool. We're logged into EarthRanger. We have events. How do we do something with them? Say we want to check them out in some capacity. At this point, it's kind of up to you. If you want to write them into a CSV, great. If you want to give them to another system, great. We are going to simply serve them out with a simple web server into a page so that you can see a really ugly list of events. Because That's what we're doing today, I guess. So if you want to view your results in a browser, you need to set up a server that does two things. It hosts a web page that lets you list the results. It also gives you an endpoint where that web page can ask for the results so that you can add interactivity and start making an application that chatters with the EarthRanger API without being authenticated itself because you've already logged in. And that's really the basic flow for any web application. It asks for something, it receives something, it visualizes it. Cool, so we're going to jump straight ahead to that. Okay, we have cleaned up our initialization file. Rather than having it do everything, we are doing exactly what it should do, which is initialize, which is only the code necessary to start the app. Creates the client, it authenticates your system, and then it returns the client. Just like before, a return value means that you can access it by calling the function. So, I mean, let's just say that this was, something else. Hello. You could then say, const my Redis client equals await hello. We've exported this without a name as a default, which means that when you import it elsewhere, you can name it whatever you want. So now we're going to jump over to our server. We have added Express, which is a very simple Node web server. What this lets us do is define a couple of URLs and what to do with them. We're going to say that at the base landing page, send a file, which is a web page. If you make a request to that base landing page /events, it's going to pass that request through to fetching events using our token. And then it's going to respond with the JSON of that. There's some other configuration in terms of setting up how file paths are made. That's kind of beyond the scope of this conversation. But you'll see, here's the one other important thing I want to point out in this file, which is to, like described, we're getting our client by initializing, which we've imported from our init file. So rather than requesting directly for a token in this file, we simply read it from our memory store, return its value. Then you can see where we pass it into fetch events, and that's how we have authenticated access into the events API without having to re-ask for it every time. I think I already did, so it should run quickly. So you can see we have Express and our dependencies now. Slowly snowballing them, but we're pretty much done now. And now we can run npm start again. Listening on port 3000 means that if you go to a web browser, because it's a local application, you go to localhost. You add 3000 for the port. Now we have a really great web application. Let's jump over to that. This is as bare bones as it gets for a web page. It's truly just a few lines of HTML. And so again, using JavaScript, which we chose for this exercise because it works on both the front end and the back end, you'll see that we're using the exact same syntax. We're saying the events, where you await a fetch to an events API, and you pull the JSON out of that. And then we have some code that we don't need to go over that just says, all right, build a table on the web page out of that. And you can see that in about 35 minutes of talking, we have made an application that can log into EarthRanger, pull operational data, and write it into a simple web page. In the interest of time, we're just going to jump straight to the next and last step that I was planning on talking about today, although yes. It'd be great to do some Q&A because I know there's going to be a lot of conversations I'd like to have with aspiring developers, but the next step is to add some interactivity to the page. So you'll see that we've done a little something extra. Fetch events now takes the access token. It also accepts parameters. Parameters are, as we described in the API documentation, all of these parameters, all of these different values that we can pass to the API to be more specific with our request. Rather than saying, give me all requests, Give me requests that are collections. Give me requests inside of a map bounding box. You can specify the sort direction. So we are passing those parameters into the function. But where are they defined? In our web application. That's right, fetch and update. So you can see that we've made a function called fetch and update that accepts a string. And it builds a query. You attach that function to an input by finding that input, adding the input event listener, pulling the value out. Sorry, we're just crunched for time, so I'm really glossing over this. And then calling our fetch and update function. So get element by ID, filter text, so you look in your code, and you have an input with an ID of filter text. Great. That should really be all it takes to wire that together. Again, we're listening on port 3000. Everything has worked thus far. All right. So, same as before, but you'll notice our little filter thing. So let's filter it. So you'll see that now we have the full chain of functionality. You give it a request, you specify a filter, it passes it through to your URL, which is actually your own API endpoint. You've built your own API in the source of using an API. It's turtles all the way down. You fetch your events, you return them, and the web page draws them on the screen. And that's the end of my time, and it was a little hasty and a little constrained because of some tech issues at the beginning. But does anyone have any questions about this? Or we all just glazed over from watching someone write code for 45 minutes, which is fine too. Yes?
So, are these kind of, are the slides going to be posted somewhere?
Yes. So I know this is kind of like a weird way to absorb this information. So I'm in the process of getting clearance to open source this demo code with all the steps in it, so you can check out each branch and watch through it. And I'll also be adding the slides to that so that you can reference them together. Because the slides, the step names in the slides match the steps of the branches.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Where would that be, Joshua?
It's going to be at the PADAS GitHub. So I'll be following up with the attendees that are registered here today with a link to all the materials that you'd want to download to play with for this.
What about the code?
Yes.
You ready to GitHub?
Yes, that's right. The code will be open sourced on GitHub.
Okay.
I have some hoops to jump through with our parent company, AI2, but it should be up there within a week.
Week.
Yeah. Hoops.
How many people in the room use JavaScript or any other languages? You do? Okay, good.
All right, I got like 3.
Python? Excellent. Okay. Winning.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Chris is just committed to creating a Python version of this then to add to GitHub, so great work.
Yeah, soon. Not within the week, but something similar for helping you gain an understanding of how to code against the Gundi platform, especially.
Yes, especially. So really the one takeaway I want from this, the purpose of this session is really to publicize the API documentation and to show people that it's a little overwhelming to jump into, but it does not take more than, let's see, a combined 95 lines of code standing between you and your own application that is integrated with EarthRanger, which you can then do whatever you want with. Pull the data out, insert data in, advanced analysis outside of what EarthRanger does, et cetera, et cetera.
So, okay.
Yeah, please. Please.
So it means, okay, I can collect data from I can get the data from EarthRanger, maybe do a processing of which and then return it to EarthRanger rather than calling for support from you guys.
Yes, exactly. Because the data is yours, and like any gateway that stops you from getting it easily is, just a grievance. So the idea is that this is a way to empower yourself to pull the data that you need and process it without either contacting support or relying on the export interfaces in the UI, which can be kind of limited.
Another question.
Yes, please.
Is this open API documentation available to everyone?
It is currently only behind an admin login,
Okay.
which is unfortunate. So that is a limitation. You have to have administrative access, but we have started conversations around bringing this out so that it's available to anyone with an EarthRanger account with the right permission.
Okay. So the steps to get to this documentation, I would log into the admin page
That's right.
in EarthRanger. Then I could browse to this URL and see exactly what Joshua's seeing.
Exactly.
This is the quickest thing ever, creating the interactive API.
Yeah, and it's lived there for a long time. We just don't make it like very publicly known, and I want to change that so more people feel comfortable pulling data out of EarthRanger.
Oh,
Yeah.
I thought it was publicly known.
No, I feel like most people I show it to are very surprised.
Oh.
Yeah.
I
You're
still
blessed
see
to know.
trouble accessing it because I'm trying to get it using my admin,
Mhm.
still getting the 404.
So I think right now you have to put a slash at the end in order to get there. Let me know if that helps. Otherwise, I'm just going to be hanging out here for a while, answering any nerdy questions that people may have, but that effectively concludes this session. So thank you so much for coming and letting me talk at you for a long time. And I hope you're having a good user conference. I'm going to unplug now.